Well, I want to say good morning to all of our viewers joining us in the United States. Good afternoon to people in Europe and wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this webinar presented by the American-German Institute at Johns Hopkins University. I'm Jeff Rathke, president of the Institute, and I am really excited about this topic, which is a crucial one for transatlantic security, for international security more broadly, and that is we're starting off looking at Germany's nuclear interests, and then we're going to expand that circle to bring in a transatlantic and a global dimension. And we've got an excellent lineup of speakers to help us do that. And I'm really pleased at this point to hand things over to my colleague, Dr. Steve Szabo, who is a senior fellow here at AGI and who is going to moderate this program today. So for the next hour, we're going to take you on a journey through nuclear policy, and Steve is going to guide us on that journey. Steve, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you all for joining us for this, unfortunately, very timely discussion. We now have to start thinking again seriously about nuclear weapons, but in a very even different sort of context, as we will see. The questions that Germany faces, of course, is how does a non-nuclear country, a country that signed treaties that have, when it was reunified, particularly to reemphasize this non-nuclear status, how does that deal with threats of nuclear intimidation that they are now seeing from Putin's Russia? Can it continue to rely on the extended American nuclear deterrent, particularly given all the chaos that's happening right now in this country, and questions about a political reliability of the United States and its deterrent? Is there a European alternative to the American deterrent? Will there even be a discussion in the future about a German deterrent if everything else fails? And finally, how does Germany, this is a point that Karl-Heinz gets into, how does Germany educate a public that has not really wanted to think very much about these kinds of issues, and has a country that has, I would say, still a pretty thin strategic bench compared to that in France, the UK, and of course in the US. These are just some of the questions that Karl-Heinz Kamp has addressed in his very interesting new book. In English, it's called Germany's Nuclear Interests After the Ukraine War, published by Nomos Verlag. Only available right now in German. Karl-Heinz, of course, is known to a lot of the people in the security community. He's currently a lecturer at the University Rome Tre. He's an associate fellow at the DGAP, the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin. He has served as the president of the Federal Academy of Security Policy in Berlin, and as research director of the NATO Defense College, and as a special envoy of the political director in the German Defense Ministry. So highly qualified person to talk about these issues. And I really highly recommend his excellent book for those of you who read German. I'm delighted to have with us again two excellent commentators. First, Professor Marina Henke, who is professor of international relations at the Hertie School in Berlin, and she directs the Hertie Center for International Security there in Berlin. She is currently the Helmut Schmidt a distinguished visiting professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and has published widely on grand strategy, nuclear strategy, and European security and defense policy. Among her numerous publications is Constructing Allied Cooperation, which has won many Best Book Awards. And finally, last but certainly not least, Rob Litwak, who is Senior Vice President and Director of International Security Studies at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars here in Washington. He's a consultant to Los Alamos National Lab. He served on the National Security Council as a director for nonproliferation, has had many fellowships and teaching assignments, and is the author of Rogue States and U.S. Foreign Policy, Outlier States, and I think most recently and most interestingly for our discussion today, Tripolar Instability, Nuclear Competition Among the United States, Russia, and China, because as he will point out, we're dealing in a very different environment than we did during the Cold War, when a lot of these theories of nuclear deterrence were developed. So with that as background, I'd be happy to turn the floor over first to Karl-Heinz Kamp. Karl-Heinz.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for having me in this discussion. It is, in the meantime, a no-brainer that the Ukraine war changed everything in security policy, also with regard to nuclear weapons. We had, very interesting, last year, in June last year, a couple of months after the attack, we had a poll in Germany, which indicated that 52% of the Germans are in favor of US nuclear weapons on German soil. 65% of these supporters were, which came from the Greens. So what the hell happened in this country, which saw the biggest anti-nuclear protests in the 80s? So it's apparently worth to have a closer eye on Germany and nuclear deterrence. And I would like to raise three questions. First, what has changed, or what has been changed by the Ukraine war with regard to nuclear weapons and deterrence? Second, what are Germany's nuclear interests? Maybe they're comparable to many other European countries. And third, very simple, always what the politicians are asking: what shall Germany, what shall the government do? Let me start by what has changed by the Ukraine war. 5 quick remarks. The first one is that it is obvious that nuclear weapons played a crucial role right from the outset of the war. Russia threatened the use of nuclear weapons in a way which didn't even happen in the darkest hour of the Cold War. By the way, Putin formulated a little bit more carefully. So far, fortunately, this threat didn't become a reality. Still, it is possible. It might be unlikely, but still, nuclear escalation cannot be excluded. And more importantly, or maybe almost more importantly, nuclear weapons safeguarded the Russian intervention, and it made the war possible. Probably, if you imagine in a counterfactual way, if there wouldn't have been nuclear weapons around, Russia might not have attacked, or NATO or the US or whoever would have long intervened in favor of Ukraine and would have defeated Russia, maybe decisively. Second point is there will be no arms control mechanisms with Russia for many years to come, simply because there is no base of trust in the Russian regime, and without a minimum of trust, you cannot have any agreement. This is a tragedy. It's a tragedy because we are lacking elements of communication and confidence building, and maybe even of crisis management. And this means that the Russian nuclear capacity will remain as it is, and the Chinese might even grow. Third point, the idea of the nuclear-free world has proven what it always was, an illusion. And this is not a tragedy at all, simply because it helped to get rid of a pipe dream. Obama had this pipe dream in 2009. The UN has the pipe dream with the ban treaty of 2021. Not to be misunderstood, a nuclear-free world might be a better one. I don't exclude this. The trouble is that, and this is something what the so-called abolitionists always forget, is that the nuclear states don't want to abolish their nuclear weapons. Whether we like it or not, nuclear states regard them as an element of their national security. And that's why Pakistan has them because of India, and India has them because of China, and China because of Russia, and so on. And Russia has them, as we just heard, to safeguard its intervention. Of course, Israel has them for all the reasons we see now. France has them for the reason of grandeur, and North Korea has them because it has a nuttish government. So a huge amount of reasons why they have them, and they don't want to get rid of them. This means, number 4, that nuclear weapons remain a factor in world politics, and the Ukraine war has even raised the relevance of nuclear weapons because it protected and protects Russia from external intervention. And this is why Iran, for instance, is so keen on having nuclear weapons. And this means that the number of nuclear states might even rise. And this means that also nuclear deterrence keeps an important role in war prevention, as it confronts every attack against nuclear state with a risk of escalation. That's basically the old school of deterrence. And number 5, this means for Germany and for most other European NATO members that nuclear deterrence still needs to be provided by the US. There is no other provider of nuclear deterrence, extended deterrence within the alliance. This doesn't make it easier, simply because the transatlantic relations are not as stable, not as robust as they have been years ago. The US is less and less willing to subsidize European security, and the resurgence of an isolationist president, sort of Trump number 2, cannot be excluded. And for that reasons, we have to make transatlantic relations Trump-proof. Just as a side note, Trump-proof. And the 100 billion Germany provided is not a bad means to do them Trump-proof. The flip side of all this is that we have to further deal with a dangerous concept. Nuclear deterrence is dangerous because it can go wrong, and a failure would be a disaster. And moreover, as we all know, it's full of dilemmas and open questions. And the biggest weakness of it is the question of credibility. How credible is retaliation, is my threat of retaliation, if I risk the danger of self-destruction? And it gets even more, it gets even more difficult when we talk about extended deterrence. Means the idea that a nuclear state, the US, takes a nuclear commitment for its non-nuclear allies. And how credible is the US nuclear commitment for non-nuclear allies? This is a question which is basically as old as NATO. How likely is it that the US president risks San Francisco to save Berlin or Warsaw? We in Europe and also in the US, we always try to answer these questions by technical means, by stationing of nuclear weapons in Europe or on German soil, or by having Pershings, because this makes this credibility, or this makes the threat more credible. At the end, it is nuclear theology. You can believe it or not, whether this commitment of your nuclear ally is credible or not. France, for instance, did not believe it. France said from the beginning that nuclear deterrence is a national concept which only can protect the nation states, and this is why France acquired their own nuclear weapons, because it is saying in French, la nucléaire ne se partage pas. You cannot divide the nuclear, which is not a stupid conclusion, by the way. So, point number 2, having said all this, what are Germany's nuclear interests? And it might be strange that a non-nuclear country has nuclear interests, but since we were the most nuclear armed country in the Cold War, we had nuclear interests. At that time, we were geographically located at the Iron Curtain, and we were the nuclear battlefield, the potential nuclear battlefield of any war with the Warsaw Pact. And this is why Germany had at that time 3 basic nuclear interests. The first is that deterrence remains credible, which means that there's no war at all, because we would be all dead in Europe, particularly in Germany. The second interest was that we have as much information as possible on what the US and also the UK, which also has nuclear weapons on our soil, what are the plans, where are the locations, how many weapons are there. I mean, if you are the potential battlefield, you want to know what your allies are doing. So the second interest was information. And the third interest was participation. We Germans and other Europeans as well, wanted to influence US nuclear planning on how do you want to use nuclear weapons in case, what are your ideas, simply to minimize the damage for Germany in case of war. And as we all know, the US granted all this information and participation through NATO, through the NATO Nuclear Planning Group. We even had NATO consultation guidelines in the 70s and 80s. If we are now back in the world where nuclear deterrence counts again, then Germany has again nuclear interests. And they are basically the same. First, that deterrence works, doesn't fail. We are still fairly close to a potential battlefield here in Europe. And second, of course, it is the interest in information to know what is happening on our soil and participation trying to influence nuclear planning of the US. And this is why we, Germany, have to affect the nuclear strategy debate in other countries, particularly in the US, to shape our nuclear future, not to be shaped by others. This will not be easy because we in Germany have forgotten lots of the nuclear expertise in the past, and the same was true for other European countries for very good reasons. The nuclear planning group was dormant in NATO until 2014. Nuclear planning wasn't done because there was no need for nuclear planning at that time. Hence, a part of the Zeitenwende will be to actively pursue Germany's nuclear interests again. And this leads to the third point, what to do. What shall a government do? Let me first talk a short moment on what we should not do. First, we should not talk about German nuclear weapons. There is no need for them. There are legal impediments for Germany to do so. Fortunately, in the entire political spectrum, no one does. Usually, no idea is stupid enough that anyone in the political spectrum takes it up. Fortunately, except some few academics, there's hardly anyone who pursues this as a need. Okay, and this is why I think we should not talk about this, because it would put the entire discussion on the wrong track. And the second thing we should not do is talking about alternatives to US nuclear extended deterrence, because there are no alternatives. Those in Germany who still talk about a potential French extended deterrence capacity just ignore that France rejects the idea of extended nuclear deterrence. So France cannot step in by definition. So what we should do is first, Germany has to acquire nuclear expertise, again, what in NATO has been called rising the nuclear IQ, which means government officials, parliamentarians, civil servants, also journalists, have to be educated on the nuts and bolts of nuclear deterrence again, including its dilemmas, by the way. The number of university professors in Germany who teach nuclear deterrence is less than the fingers of one hand. Political academies in Germany don't teach this. When I was the president of the Federal Academy in 2016, I had the idea to include this in our, to include nuclear questions in our curriculum. The foreign ministry advised not to do this. It would not be the right time, was said at this time in 2016, 2 years after the annexation of Crimea. The General Staff College of the Bundeswehr in Hamburg takes nuclear courses only as a side activity. There is no single course on nuclear deterrence there. In the Cold War, in the Ministry of Defense, we had entire branches dealing with nuclear weapons, some 15 to 20 officers dealing with this. Now we have one officer in the NATO section who does this as a part-time job. Second point, Germany has to actively pursue the nuclear debate in NATO for a new nuclear consensus, for a new nuclear document. We have a nuclear strategy document, the so-called DDPR, Deterrence and Defense Posture Review. The document is as complex as the title, but this stems from 2012, at a time when Russia was still a partner, when we dreamt of the Arab Spring, and when China was still a partner, which means it is long, long overdue. And this means that Germany has to actively push for such a strategic discussion in NATO. Why? Because A, Germany is a heavyweight just from the sheer size in NATO. And second, it is a nuclear stationing country, which means we have a special interest. And third, By doing so, Germany can regain lots of trust, which has it lost, particularly in Eastern Europe. However, the problem is if Germany enters in such a debate or pursues such a debate, then fairly unpleasant questions come up. First, do we need a new Nachrüstung? Do we need new nuclear weapons in Europe, or are the existing ones enough? The answer to this question doesn't have to be yes, but you have to be prepared to deal with it. Second question, we have weapons in Germany, nuclear weapons in Germany stationed. Is this still reasonable, or wouldn't they make much more sense in, let's say, Poland or in the Baltics? Or what happens if Ukraine joins NATO? Would we have to have a nuclear stationing there? Once again, difficult to decide yes or no, but you still have to be prepared to deal with these questions. And the third thing Germany has to do is we have to enter in a nuclear dialogue with France and with the UK. France and the UK does this, and the fact that France cannot be a replacement for US extended nuclear deterrence doesn't mean that we do not have an interest to discuss with one of our closest allies nuclear issues, our direct physical neighbor. France has offered this a couple of times in the recent decades, actually. Germany has always rejected it. I think this is wrong, particularly now. So therefore, we should have a not only bilateral Franco-German, but trilateral Franco-German, UK, and everyone else in Europe who wants to join dialogue on European nuclear capacities, just from the same nuclear interest, information, and participation. However, to do all this, once again, back to the first point, we have to raise our nuclear expertise and our nuclear IQ, which brings us back to the main necessity. So I believe, my last sentence, that we have a Zeitenwende in Germany, which achieved the hell of a lot, which I hadn't believed 1.5 years ago. And I hope that we will have such a Zeitenwende in the nuclear realm as well. And on that happy note, I thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you so much for a very concise presentation. I should have mentioned before, I want to mention now, for those of you who are watching, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function on the Zoom function there, and then I will look for your comments and try to pull them together. Please keep them as concise as you possibly can. Okay, thank you very much again. Let me turn first to Professor Henke.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, Karl-Heinz, I would like to congratulate you on this book. I think it's incredibly important. I couldn't agree with you more that there is a real necessity of, raising the nuclear IQ in Germany. I'm one of the very few professors, and you're right, it's just a handful who teaches nuclear security at a German university at the Hertie School in Berlin. And I full-heartedly agree with you that a lot has to be done, but also, some changes have already occurred. I remember I moved back from Chicago to Berlin in late 2019, early 2020. I then co-organized with the Munich Security Conference a workshop for members of the German parliament prior to the last federal elections on nuclear security, because, we wanted to prevent that rash decisions were made to withdraw from the nuclear security arrangement. And I must say, I was shocked by how little German parliamentarians knew about nuclear deterrence and nuclear security. And this was for me kind of like the introduction to, the lack and the complete, demise of nuclear expertise among our decision makers. I was just on a panel at the German American conference at the Kennedy School this past weekend, and it was a panel on technology and security. And the students asked me which technology influenced Russia's war on Ukraine the most. And I think they all expected me to say cyber or drones. But my very clear answer was nuclear, because also what you just mentioned, I think it had a tremendous impact on the war, because it explains that NATO still is very much restrained. So I think, we would be in a very, very different situation in Ukraine. And, as you mentioned, maybe Russia wouldn't have started this war in the first place without nuclear weapons. I want to make two comments. The first one is where, I think I disagree with some of the ideas that you propose in the book a little bit. And that actually, regards the question, what type of IQ, what type of knowledge do we need to raise? It seems to me that, like you're kind of thinking that it's enough to resuscitate the knowledge that we have used and, like Germans were actually pretty good at during the Cold War. And I would suggest that we're actually in a very different world right now. And the nuclear age that we have entered is quite different to the nuclear age that we confronted during the Cold War. So this is the first section of my comments. And the second section is, like what can be Europe's, Germany's role in this new nuclear age that I think we have entered already. So let me start with the first one. What type of expertise do we actually need to create in Germany and in Europe? The big questions during the Cold War, they faced a deterrence of the Soviet Union, and in the big picture of things, there were two poles. There was the Soviet Union and NATO, and of course inside of NATO the United States, and then the smaller European powers, either the UK or France, and then these nuclear sharing mechanisms. Today, the deterrence that we need to think of is not just this duopoly, if I may say, between NATO and the Soviet Union, but actually we need to deter at least 3 different actors in 3 different theaters. The first one is the Eurasian theater, absolutely. But the second one is the Pacific. And the third one, I would say, is the Middle East. So we can't just, even as Germany, as Europe, we can't just think of how can we deter Russia. We always also need to include in these discussions and our strategizing what's actually happening in the Pacific theater. And here it's, as you mentioned before, the growth in nuclear weapons of the Chinese government, but then of course already the presence of nuclear weapons in North Korea. And there are a lot of scenarios that are being discussed in a possible escalation over Taiwan, that exactly in this possible moment North Korea then uses nuclear weapons. And we can even go further and say we, need to at least intellectually work through the possibility that we have 2 simultaneous nuclear crises, one in the Pacific theater and one involving Russia, so to speak, in the European theater. And, even if you really want to, go to the extremes, and a nuclear armed Iran that can also create havoc in the Middle East. So I think deterrence and how we think about nuclear weapons has grown much more complex than during the Cold War. And the new generation that we need to train needs to get used to these types of scenarios and get trained in these types of scenarios. But it doesn't actually stop there. In Russia, the scenario was mostly focused on tactical nuclear weapons. A doctrine that was developed during the Cold War by NATO, so the notion that a conventionally weaker party uses tactical nuclear weapons, so in a coercive scenario, or like with a psychological function of deterring further investment and further advance by the opponent, has now been used by Russia to kind of destroy a consensus in NATO, or even destroy the will to fight in Ukraine, and also to support Ukraine from the NATO sides. This was the main scenarios that are still, by the way, being discussed in a lot of fora in Europe, in NATO here in the United States. And I think we don't have developed a good answer to that. We don't have developed a good answer to deter it, although so far it has been deterred, but it doesn't mean that we will be able to keep on deterring such a scenario, because such a scenario of the conventionally weaker side here in this scenario between NATO and Russia also exists between Pakistan and India, possibly also between China and the United States and the Pacific, between North Korea and the United States. So how can we deter these kind of de-escalate scenarios? And if such a tactical nuclear strike actually occurs, how do we respond? I was in, multiple working groups thinking through the scenario. How could NATO, how could the United States respond to a Russian tactical nuclear strike? And the truth is, in not a single one of these workshops, a truly good answer was found. A lot of possibilities were discussed, but I don't think we actually have the golden answer to such a scenario. But I think, the possibility of such a nuclear use is still very, very high. Third, we have new technologies. During the Cold War, there was, to a certain degree, strategic stability. There was mutual assured destruction. And, one can make an argument that this kept, even during the Cold War, the war at a cold state and not at a hot state. But now we need to think through what happens if hypersonic missiles are developed, where basically missile defense systems no longer work. They're too fast and they're maneuverable. And also, of course, then, on the flip side, can missile defense system by, energy-directed weapon systems, which is a little bit more in the future, the hypersonic missiles and glide vehicles are already being tested. The energy-directed or laser weapons, they're still like in a much earlier phase. But what do this new technology that has been, clearly, been thought through and been developed, how does this actually affect nuclear deterrence and nuclear security? And then, also in the nuclear field, but I, would kind of put it at a little bit, maybe less of an acute prospect, but it is also to use nuclear weapons or delivered by drones or by other kind of underwater drone type unmanned vehicles. So for example, the Poseidon that the Russians are supposedly developing. So I really think that, the nuclear age that we are in right now, to a certain degree, is much more complex than the nuclear age that we were in during the Cold War. And as I mentioned before, I think, when we start training this new generation in Germany, in Europe, we need to start there, of course, building on all the knowledge that has been already acquired during the Cold War. But, I think there's a totally different new layer that we need to put on top of this. And frankly, we haven't found good answers, right? You're just scratching at the surface. Even here, I'm right now in Washington. Even here, very highly skilled nuclear theorists don't have answers to these critical questions. But, Germany and, the Europeans need to start also investing in these discussions and not just resuscitating the knowledge that we had before. So that leads me to the second part of my remarks, and that looks at what's Europe's role in all of this. And first and foremost, again, I'm at the Kissinger Center. A lot of folks from the Pentagon come through here, and I hear very often the notion that right now the Biden administration looks at the American alliance network, and they speak of a spider web. So in the middle, it's the United States, it's the main actor, and then they have all sorts of different poles. Of course, in Europe, the NATO allies, but then also in the Pacific. And the poles are linked, but actually, the linkages are fairly loose, like in a spider web. Everything then, centers on the United States, the big spider. And it might have certain benefits. So at least, I think how Jake Sullivan and also Pentagon planners think through, this is how they can capture, the enemies. But in the big picture of things, if the center gets distracted, if the spider gets distracted, whether this is internally, you mentioned Trump, but there are also other domestic fights that I can imagine here in the United States, or externally, the spider might actually be quite fragile. So I'm very much in favor that we need to think of pillars, and we need to construct a European pillar and maybe even an Asian pillar. But, I'm not an expert on Asia, and I know that it's much harder there. But certainly in Europe, I think we need to construct a pillar that can, really engage in burden sharing and is not as fragile as the spider web as we conceive it right now. And here, Karl-Heinz, I also fully agree with you. It cannot just be a German French corporation. The UK needs to be involved. And I would even say that all the European NATO members need to be involved in this European pillar that then can pick up the slack if the United States gets distracted or no longer wants to be as involved as before. I think only, and even if we imagine the Ukraine scenario, if right now the United States would pull out, I think, like the European structure would fall apart, but a truly strong European pillar, I think, could pick up some of the slacks. So my proposal would be to think in, like nuclear strategic terms, also in a European pillar format, for example, also including Turkey, although, I'm very much aware of the difficulty sometimes that is dealing with Turkey. So what kind of role can Europe then play inside of this European pillar? And here also, in your book, you're kind of doubting that the B61 model of nuclear sharing, is fit for the future. And, partially I agree with you, but, I just want to put it out here. What is one of the advantages of this model? It is that, you can integrate it into the escalation ladder. So there's a lot of flexibility that brings B-61s and fighter jets in the signaling process. So you can ready the jets on the runway, you can mount the weapons, you can even put them in the air, signaling that like NATO is serious about something. And with cruise missiles or ballistic missiles, of course, to a certain degree, these signaling mechanisms are a little bit more constrained. But I think also there is not just a nuclear role in nuclear deterrence, but also now a mixture of deterrence in conventional means. So, for example, I would suggest that Europe should really pick certain areas where the United States needs help. That can be space deterrence, but conventionally, or cyber deterrence. But what Europe needs to realize, in certain areas, it needs to become excellent. It cannot just be a junior partner in every single one area. And especially when I look at cyber, for example, I think this is really an area where Europe could pick up the slack, build up forces, because it's one of the areas where, like you don't need the really, really, really heavy equipment, but you need, like just an excellence in coding and cyber capabilities. And I really think that this is something where, also Eastern Europeans and Western Europeans could join forces and really, build up a force that can, contribute to burden sharing. And third, I think that Europe can play a really important role in resuscitating arms control. And you're absolutely right, Karl-Heinz. Right now, arms control is de facto dead. But in a future, I at least, hope that it will come back in one form or another, but it needs to be also a new arms control regime, needs to include China. And here, for example, I look at Germany that still has much closer relations with China. And I think Germany, once it has hopefully built up the expertise and can think through these highly complex issues that are right now contained in nuclear deterrence and nuclear security. But, Germany could be a convener because it is much more of a neutral force between the United States, Russia, and China, and really kind of like bring the arms control agenda forward. But, unfortunately, I concur with you right now, this expertise does not exist. It does not exist in the Auswärtigen Amt. It does not exist in our Defense Department. But I really think that, this is something that, maybe in the future, Germany could be proud of again to play a role. So I will stop here, Steve, and hand it over to the next panelist.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. It's a very comprehensive statement. Let me turn to Rob Litwak. Rob, please.
Thanks very much, Steve, and kudos to Karl-Heinz on the new publication and the presentation today. And let me continue with Marina's theme of complexity. I'll add to the complexity with my remarks, which will pull the optic back and look kind of in the broader strategic context. It's evident that the current moment is the most fraught since the depths of the Cold War. Russia's war in Ukraine, which the Director of National Intelligence here called a tectonic geostrategic shift, is being waged under Putin's nuclear threats. The Economist magazine last year declared, and then there were three. This was in response to the expansion of Chinese strategic nuclear forces with the evident goal of achieving parity with the United States and Russia. The Biden administration's nuclear posture review declared that by the 2030s, the United States will face two nuclear peer competitors. China is on pace to have 1,000 strategic nuclear warheads by the end of the decade, and is eschewing, evidently, its long-standing minimum deterrent posture. The shift from nuclear bipolarity to emergent tripolarity is occurring amidst a confluence of developments that are eroding strategic stability. First, the legacy arms control architecture of the Cold War, ABM, INF, is at a point of collapse. The New START treaty remains in force until 2026, limiting the United States and Russia to 1,550 strategic nuclear weapons. But of course, China is not a party to that or to the other major Cold War era arms control agreements. Meanwhile, all three powers are engaged in robust nuclear modernization programs. So we're entering a period of essentially unconstrained competition among the three major powers. Second, that competition has now extended, as we all know, into the new domains of cyber and outer space. And as referenced by Marina, new technologies threaten dislocations. For example, hypersonics blur the distinction between conventional and nuclear operations. And other technologies such as AI, anti-satellite weapons, nuclear torpedoes could exacerbate nuclear risks. The salient point here is that all of these developments are difficult to constrain through traditional arms control. Emergent tripolarity is recasting two traditional Cold War risks, and that's probably the major theme of my new publication. The first risk is what we called in the Cold War era this stability and stability paradox. That stability in the central strategic nuclear domain would deflect competition into peripheral areas, Vietnam, Afghanistan, etc. By contrast, in the current era, the stakes are not peripheral, they're vital. It's Ukraine for Russia, which is also of vital interest to the United States and our European allies. It's Taiwan for China, which the President of the United States has stated the United States would come to the defense of Taiwan if attacked. So point one, in terms of the recast risk, to shift from peripheral competition, area competition to regions, zones of vital interest. That risk is compounded by the second risk, which is the assumption of a stable nuclear deterrent. In the late 1950s, Albert Wohlstetter in Foreign Affairs famously questioned the stability of the central strategic balance in his piece, The Delicate Balance of Terror. His concern was the vulnerability of the U.S. manned bomber fleet to a surprise Soviet ICBM attack. And his main point was that a situation in which one side or the other saw an advantage in going first or early in a crisis was inherently unstable. And that dynamic was evident during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which made it so fraught. In the aftermath, the United States and Soviet Union both had deployed survivable second strike systems that created the system that Marina referred to of mutual deterrence based on assured retaliation. And the détente era codified this relationship through the arms control agreements, and it yielded a rules-bound bipolar nuclear order. Neither side saw an incentive to go first or early in a crisis. An uneasy stability based on vulnerability emerged from that. But those incentives are being revived. The initiation of great power conflict would likely come in the new domains of cyber and outer space. Those would be the first shots in a new conflict between the great powers. And it's concerning that China and Russia may not view escalation in those domains as being inherently escalatory because they don't involve the large scale loss of life as the tripwire scenarios during the Cold War did, with a conventional war escalating, because of the loss of life, involving the loss of American lives that were stationed on the front line in Germany. So we now face an eroded bipolar nuclear order and an emergent tripolar system without guardrails. In the new era, deterrent relationships are becoming, to use Wohlstetter's term, more delicate, and the incentive to go first in a crisis is increasing. Strategic stability typically encompasses two components: arms race stability and crisis stability. The current dilemma is that unconstrained competition generates arms race instability, which in turn exacerbates crisis stability in Ukraine and Taiwan, where the stakes are not peripheral, they're vital. A dangerous congruence. So let me turn, in my remaining few minutes to escalatory risks, which are created by this dangerous congruence. There are three pathways of escalation we know from the literature: accidental, inadvertent, and instrumental. Accidental, straightforward, that a false alarm, we had about a dozen of them during the Cold War, very dangerous. Now, it could be tripped by, if we introduce artificial intelligence into alerting system, highly unstable, but I'll just use a placeholder on accidental. The classic escalatory risk is kind of inadvertent, where an action taken by one side is viewed as reinforcing deterrence, but the other side views it as preparation for war. There's the problem of co-location of conventional and nuclear assets, where an attack on a conventional, where one side takes action against what it thinks is a conventional site, but it implicates the nuclear deterrent capability of the other side, leading to an escalatory dynamic. But the third one is what I wanted to focus on: instrumental escalation, which I think these developments really accentuate. Thomas Schelling famously called this instrumental escalation a competition in risk-taking to achieve objectives. In Ukraine, Russia is tenuously holding a line of control in eastern Ukraine. If that military situation were to deteriorate, Putin might attempt instrumental escalation out of desperation, as CIA Director Burns stated. This could take the form of expanding the geographical scope of the conflict by attacking NATO countries assisting Ukraine, or the use of a tactical nuclear weapon. And such a move would be consistent with what U.S. administrations have called Russia's escalate to de-escalate strategy. But concern over Putin's nuclear saber rattling, which spiked in autumn of last year, is less imminent now. And this shift was attributed by the Biden administration to the stabilization of the front and the positive deterrent effect of China's warnings against nuclear use, and improved communication between Washington and Moscow. Let me make one last point, kind of what is to be done. Here we are. The United States has proposed strategic stability talks with China, but Beijing has rebuffed those advances, evidently believing the U.S. objective in these strategic stability talks is to lock in Chinese inferiority rather. But with Russia, unlike China, we have this history, but the environment is toxic. We have some shared understandings. We thought at least about key concepts like deterrence, but such a dialogue with Russia is not possible amidst the Ukraine war. That said, there may be practical steps to reduce the escalatory risk. Let me just focus on one in closing: reinforcing deterrence. Deterrence comes in two variants: deterrence by punishment and deterrence by denial. The United States has reinforced the first, deterrence by punishment, by reiterating its collective security commitment under Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, by the prepositioning of dual use capabilities in Europe to bolster extended deterrence and the credibility of the U.S. deterrent, and declaratory policy. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that the United States would not slice the salami, that any nuclear use, whether low yield or higher yield, would be crossing that threshold. And then the other variant is deterrence by denial, which could take the form of hardening cyber and space assets to make them less vulnerable. But an important dimension of deterrence by denial, we don't think of it typically this way, because is maintaining credible conventional military forces in the key theaters to raise the cost of aggression. And that's a form of deterrence by denial. And the 100 billion that Karl-Heinz referenced is one kind of dimension of that. So with that, let me, as English would say, put a full stop, and then back to Steve to open questions, comments from the floor.
Thank you so much, all of you, for excellent comments. I mean, I think you've all really brought up, as you pointed, the different kind of complexities that we're facing now compared to problems we faced during the Cold War. We have a couple of questions, Karl-Heinz. Do you want to make some comments first before I go to the, we only have about 10 minutes, so.
No, I think
I wanted to
let's keep the time for the discussion.
Okay, you sure? Okay. I have a
Absolutely.
couple of questions here. One, question to you. What is your take on the broadening participation question? Why should Germany welcome more allies into the nuclear deterrence mission or not?
Well, I mean, first, there were years when Germany wanted to get rid of the nuclear weapons. In Germany, we had a foreign minister at that time who wanted to do this. Today, I'm not sure anymore. Germany was very nervous when Poland suggested the idea of having the nuclear weapon station there, leaving alone the cost issue. But by not being a nuclear stationing country anymore, Germany would lose its influence in the nuclear planning group. So I think it is not only that the public is a little bit more interested in nuclear, but also the administration, the government starts to realize that these nuclear weapons, whatever strategic value they have, and we can discuss this for hours, whether you need to have nuclear weapons stationed on your soil again for the credibility of extended deterrence. We have some nations in NATO or outside of NATO who do not have these things, for instance, in South Korea or Japan. But still, I think the broadening the participation, by the way, doesn't mean through nuclear stationing. We can also broaden the participants of the so-called snowcat operation. So those countries, non-nuclear countries, which support NATO's nuclear operations with conventional means. So yes, the footprint, the nuclear deterrence footprint could and should be much broader. I think you're mute.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, I have a question from Marina here concerning the European pillar. Are you thinking of a new version of the MLF, and what systems would this be based on? Land-based, air-based, or perhaps better sea-based? Remember Helmut Schmidt's dictum, nuclear weapons belong on sea, not land.
Well, as I said before, I really think we need to rethink nuclear deterrence and nuclear deterrence burden sharing, right? Because certain elements, and, like Karl-Heinz, don't understand me wrong, of course, are still prevalent. And when we teach, for example, at the Hertie School, nuclear security, we always build and do very detailed case study of all the different instances and the knowledge that was acquired during the Cold War. But, I think it became clear that the current landscape is different. There are new elements to it. And so I also think that how the European pillar then looks needs to depend on, like what type of nuclear theology can be developed that actually works in a nuclear theater that has not just the Soviet Union as the main actor, but also China, possibly Middle Eastern actors, and these new technologies.
I have a question here also for both Karl-Heinz and for Marina. Karl-Heinz, maybe you could go first. How do you assess the state of the German official thinking on integrated strategic deterrence, including nuclear, cyber, counter space, and hybrid threats that Russia and China pose to Western defenses and national resilience? Go ahead, Karl-Heinz, you go first.
Well, this fits actually neatly to the comment Marina made that it would not be enough to have only the old lessons, the Cold War lessons on deterrence, but also the new ones on the combination of conventional and nuclear deterrence and all these kind of things. Coming from the political practical world, I would be happy if at least the basics would have been understood. And when you say the knowledge or not knowledge of parliamentarians is appalling in Germany, I can tell you it is not that much better in the government and not that much better in the ministries, leaving alone the few people who are working in the respective branches. So yes, I fully agree that there are thousands of things different from the Cold War, but I mean, it is like driving a new car, which has all new fancy issues. I would be happy if the people would make their old driving license first, so that they can drive, that they understand the basics of car driving, and then we talk about the next ones in the political, practical world, not in the academic world. There, of course, much more forward thinking is necessary and possible, but having briefed politicians endlessly, there's always a rule: you cannot start low enough.
Marina, did you want to say anything on that?
No, I absolutely agree. And, what I wanted to add is, of course, and that's why also, I agree with Bob here. Germany could actually make a dent in this deterrence by denial idea. And that's why I proposed, to focus on cyber or on space, because there is a certain reluctance to really go into the heavy machinery. And, the question before was, should it be land-based or, more on the naval front. But I think, the Germans can maybe really heavily invest in the cyber front, because then there are also possibly other spillovers, right, into industries. Or space. These are new areas, or relatively new areas. And, I would love to see much more investment and real interest in those areas that go beyond, but will be defining for the future.
Okay, very good. I have one question here about no first use. What is the thinking today on no first use or sole purpose? Do Germans and Americans view this issue similarly? Could clear doctrinal statements by German officials on the dual key system strengthen deterrence by making Russia more wary, or weaken it by making the German public even more risk averse? Karl-Heinz, do you want to answer that one?
Well, I mean, I think that the dual key system and no first use are two different pairs of shoes. I think no first use was never a good idea, simply because, particularly we in Germany, particularly we in Europe, being confronted with the issue is we want to deter any kind of aggression, whether it's nuclear or conventional. There was the old saying in the Cold War that we were saying we would also be completely devastated by a non-nuclear conflict. So this idea, this threat of a first use, which means putting the risk of retaliation on every kind of attack, be it conventional, be it nuclear, and we can discuss whether certain cyber scenarios could be possible, is something which is important for us. So this is why all ideas to come to a no first use strategy, I would not regard it as very helpful. Plus, at the end of the day, any declaration in the case of a conflict isn't worth the paper it is printed on. So this is why I don't think that this is an avenue that brings us far.
Well, unfortunately, we're just about out of time. I have a lot of questions left here, but we can't answer them all. Does anybody else, Rob, do you want to make any final comments before we get off? Or
no, it's been a rich discussion. I've learned a lot from Karl-Heinz and Marina. I would just say the New Yorker magazine used to have a feature called "Block That Metaphor." I would stay away from the spider web thing. It has connotations, and just go with hub and spoke or pillar or whatever other metaphor you want to use. The other thing is picking up on a point that Karl-Heinz made. Jake Sullivan, I guess it was, had spoken about in the Asian context of the hardware and the software of the relationship. And I think, we need to have that kind of conversation. It's a more mature conversation with NATO allies, where there's been a lot of discussion on hardware, pre-positioning of capabilities, and also a legacy of progress on the software side, so to speak, because there is this history of the nuclear planning group and including allies in decision making. And I think it's a positive sign that that's being kind of reactivated. And kudos to Marina on the work of her institution of raising public and elite knowledge on nuclear issues. It's just been the reaction she had at Harvard, like a surprise that it's nuclear. People, because it's the technology of Glenn Miller and slide rules, people sort of think of it as an old technology, but it's sort of back to basics and made even more complex because of the escalatory risks and just how bad it is. And one last comment. Russian nuclear doctrine stipulates that nuclear weapons can be used if the survival of the state is at risk, an existential threat. And unfortunately, Putin holds his, I mean, it's l'état c'est moi. He holds his regime synonymous with the survival of the Russian state. So if Russia goes down in the Ukraine front, it would have a feedback effect into the stability of the Putin regime and might, you know, create a very unstable dynamic from this kind of Russian leader who is known to miscalculate and take risks.
On that happy note, thank you for an excellent panel. I'll turn it back to Jeff for the final words, but thank you again for all your participation. Jeff.
There's no point trying to summarize all of that. It's been a tremendous discussion. I want to thank you, Steve, for organizing it so well. Thanks to Karl-Heinz for the book, and congratulations, and to Marina and Rob, tremendous contributions from your side. And thanks to all of our viewers for being with us. Saw a lot of familiar names out there, and I'm glad that you joined us. And we look forward to having as many of you as possible with us at the next event we host virtually. So thanks so much.